Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that I have a brand new masterclass coming out on the 18th of April. It's the 7 Steps to Podcasting. This was voted for by my social media audience. It won out against the other by a margin, so I will do both at some point, but the first one is going to be the 7 Steps to Podcasting. So if you want to come and join me for this masterclass, it's going to run for about an hour on the 18th at 4 p.m. UK time. So join me by hitting the link in the show notes or head over to donnaeade.com/7 podcast steps, all one word. That's donnaeade.com/7 podcast steps. Now back to the episode. You're listening to the Mindset and Action podcast, the place to be to grow and streamline your business. I'm your host, Donna Eade. Let's jump into the show. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. I am so happy to have you here with me today for this episode of the Mindset and Action podcast. So we're going to be talking about the perks and pitfalls of podcasting today. How many P's can I put in there? It seems to be a thing that I'm doing recently. It's doing lots of the same things. So the other week was fabulous. I was saying fabulous a lot, and in that intro, lots of P's. So lots of practice with my voice, I think, which is always fun. So today we're going to be talking about podcasting. And with that being said, I wanted to remind you that the Mic Action podcast, which is my second podcast, is now live. There are 5 episodes up as we are talking here today, so it's very easy to catch up. But if podcasting is something that you have been looking at doing in your business, then it is the podcast you need to go and listen to, because every episode is about podcasting, whether that is bringing on a guest to talk about their podcast and their whys behind it and the issues that they've had and the successes they've had, or whether it's me talking about why you want to podcast, what it can do for your business, the equipment that you need, and etc. All of those things, it is all on that podcast. So if you haven't yet listened to that, then head over to your podcast player, search Mic Action Podcast. It should come up. If not, you can go over to donnaeade.com/mic-action-podcast, and I will link it in the show notes of this episode. It should be in the show notes of every Mindset and Action podcast episode, so you can always head to the show notes to get that link. So go ahead and have a listen to those first 5 episodes and let me know what you think. And on the conversation of podcasting, I want to let you know that the new cohorts for spring are now open. I have 3 cohorts starting in April and May. If you want to start your podcast, you want to get it out there in the world, you want to be showing up in a bigger, better, more dynamic way for your audience, and you want to do that through podcasting, then fill in your application today. I am doing a masterclass on the 18th, which you probably would have heard in the introduction before this episode started. If you want to come along to that, see more about me, who I am and how I teach, then feel free to register there. But applications are open now and spaces are limited. So I only take on a maximum of 6 people per cohort, which means there are 18 spaces available. So if you want to secure one of those spaces, fill in your application now. We'll have a conversation, we'll get everything squared away, and we'll get your space locked in so that you don't miss out when the masterclass happens and I announce it at the end of the masterclass. You've got that extra time to get your application in. So that is available at donnaeade.com/apply. So if you go there, you can do that application. Okay, so now on to the perks and pitfalls of podcasting, because you know me, I am very honest with you guys. It's not something that I want to put out there that everything is always sunshine and roses. I feel a lot of entrepreneurs tend to put that out in the world and don't really share the downside to things and the fact that, it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't. It just simply isn't the case, because otherwise everybody would be successful and everybody would be a millionaire. And that's just not how it is. And sometimes that is not because the person didn't try hard enough. It's for whatever reason, what they were trying didn't work for them. And so it is important that we weigh up both sides. We look at it from our own perspective and what we want out of it and what success looks like to us, to know whether it is something that is right for us. So I want to start with the pitfalls, because, we want to end on a high, right? I started on a high, we'll end on a high. So we'll stick those nasty pitfalls in the middle there. So the number one pitfall I think people will come across when they start a podcast is thinking that it's easy. Nothing in life that's worth doing is easy, is what I kind of think is true. I mean, I would have to think about everything to sit there and think that across every aspect of life. But, if it comes really easy and you don't have to work for it, then it kind of takes away the joy in it, in my view anyway. So, podcasting isn't easy. There are easy processes. You can simplify it. But if it was easy, everybody who started a podcast would still be podcasting. And the fact is, and I've told this stat before, that most podcasters give up after episode 3. It is a staggering stat that 90% of people will stop podcasting after episode 3. So it's really important to know that actually there are a lot of people out there that don't find it easy and haven't found the way to do it that works for them and gives them the best result for them, and they give up, or they stop, or they change their mind. Whatever happens, they don't podcast anymore. So thinking that it is easy, and there are lots of people out there who teach podcasting that will tell you, oh, it's really easy, and the nuts and bolts of it are pretty simple. However, if you are not tech-minded, for example, then the tech side is going to be something that you're going to struggle with and you're going to need help with, which is why I hold your hand through that process in my program, and I actually give you extra one-to-one support if it's needed, because I don't want the tech to stop you. But if tech is something that you struggle with, then podcasting isn't going to be easy. If you find it difficult to hold a conversation by yourself, if you can't go on Instagram Live, for example, and do, a live for 10-15 minutes, you might find podcasting quite difficult, because you are essentially talking to yourself for 20 minutes, however long your podcast is. So there are skills that you need. And once you have learnt those skills and once you have your systems in place, it can become easy. But I wouldn't say that podcasting is easy off the bat. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is number two pitfall is thinking you need thousands of downloads and that it's easy to get them. So this is another thing that people think, that, podcasting is about getting thousands of downloads. And because people are always talking about thousands of downloads, that means that it must be pretty easy to get thousands of downloads, because these people are still podcasting. So they must be getting thousands of downloads, right? Wrong. Very wrong. I've been very open and transparent about my numbers in the past, and I always tell the story of how my very first episode of this podcast that you're listening to had just 10 downloads in the first 30 days. This is not something that happens overnight, and certainly it doesn't do very well if you don't do a launch, which is what I didn't do with this podcast originally. So thousands of downloads isn't what you need unless you want hundreds of thousands of customers. You've got to look at what it is that you want from your podcast to know what you're aiming for. Now, for me, I need around 30 clients a year. That's all I need. So if I had thousands of downloads every week or every month, and therefore thousands of people that are listening to me, and then I had hundreds of people reaching out wanting to work with me, I would be over capacity and wouldn't be able to handle that. So there is no point in my podcast having thousands of downloads because that wouldn't work for the business model I have. For you, it may be different. Maybe thousands of downloads is more appropriate, but you need to know what you actually want out of it and why you want that out of it before you start judging yourself and your podcast on the downloads. And I've said it before, I will say it again, I will keep saying it, that downloads really don't mean much because people can download your podcast without ever listening to it, and they can listen to your podcast without ever downloading it. So there is no hard and fast rule that tells you that because you've had this many downloads, it means that this many people have listened to your podcast. It doesn't mean that. Okay, so I really want to try and get you to avoid that pitfall by not thinking about the downloads as this is how many people are listening to my podcast every week, but as a metric to measure the improvement and growth of your podcast over time. Okay, so it's not about thousands of downloads, and it's not easy to get downloads as you might think it is. When you see YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of views and things like that, you look at how many subscribers they've got to get those and how long it takes. And I heard somebody talk about how you needed to be consistent on YouTube with good quality content for 2 years before you start to gain traction. And that's in the current YouTube climate. You know, might have been easier back in the day, but now that's what you're looking at. And I feel that it's the same with podcasting, that you do have to have this consistency of good quality content that you're putting out to gain traction. And there are things that you can do to boost yourself. So for me, launching is a huge part of that. It is something that I teach and talk about a lot, is having a good launch process in place before you launch your podcast so that you can give it the best possible start. And then things that you can do throughout your podcast that can help to boost and generate more from it. But getting thousands of downloads isn't necessarily the goal for a majority of podcasters. And those that think that that is the goal are often the people that give up well before they've actually gained traction and started seeing the results that they actually want, because they're too busy trying to go for the goal that they think that they want, if that makes sense. So downloads, that's another pitfall, is falling into the habit of thinking that you have to have thousands of downloads. The number three pitfall is forgetting to market your podcast. And I saw this from somebody who I follow online who just happened to mention it in a post the other week that was just like, oh, by the way, I've got a podcast. I never talk about it. And I was just like, duh, this is a prime marketing tool for you and your business. You need to be talking about it a lot, because this is a great way of people getting to know you, getting to like you, and getting to trust you in your area of expertise. Now, if you are inundated with clients and you don't need any more clients, maybe you don't need that. Maybe you're just putting it out there as a way to give back. And, you're very much falling in the category of those people that need to hear it will find it, and thinking that way. If you are, that's fantastic. But if you are looking at it as an opportunity to reach more people and grow your business, you need to be talking about it, because if you don't talk about it, how is anybody going to know it's there? They may well come across it. And if you have got your SEO search stuff done well, then potentially people are going to come across it when they're searching for certain things. But that is a lot of work, a lot of energy that you need to put out there consistently to get that back. Okay, so the easiest way to get people to listen to your podcast is to share it yourself, rather than hoping that they will find it from a Google search. Okay, so that is kind of the third pitfall I see, is people start a podcast, they launch a podcast, and they barely talk about their podcast. So that would be number 3. Number 4 pitfall I see is people over scripting their podcasts. So there are a number of ways that you can do a podcast, and it depends on the type of podcast that you're doing. So let me break it down into those types. So if, for example, you are a storytelling podcast, so there is a podcast out there called the Mr. Bollen podcast. I absolutely love Mr. Bollen. I watch him on YouTube. I haven't listened to the podcast yet, but it is definitely one that I want to start listening to, because I want to start listening to more entertainment-based podcasts, because I listen to an awful lot of business podcasts. So that's one on my list to listen to. Now, he's telling you a story of strange, dark and mysterious stories, and that's what he's doing. So he needs to have a script to read out to you, but he does it in a way that is animated, and he gives himself some freedom in there to talk off script, as it were. But he's been doing this for a number of years, and he's really good at it. If you are a voiceover actor who is used to reading scripts and making them sound natural, you could get away with over scripting a podcast episode and delivering it in a way that sounds natural. But for somebody like me, who is doing a business podcast, if you over script it, it comes off as robotic. And I hope that you can tell from the way that I talk in my podcast that this is not a scripted show. I'm not sitting here reading from a script, because I would have to literally speak the podcast to a Google Doc, however you can do that, where you actually speak like notation to my notes in my phone or something, and have it noted down that way to actually read the way I'm speaking now. But if I was to read the way I'm speaking now, I wouldn't be able to make it sound as natural as it sounds, because I'm just speaking. Yeah, do you get what I mean? So it is really important to be authentic in what you're doing. And oftentimes, if it is highly scripted, it can come off as inauthentic, because your tonality, your emotion, the way you speak, the way you animate yourself, because even though people can't see you, your animations are what makes your voice. So I use my hands when I talk, and I'm using my hands right now as I am talking to you. You can't see it, but if I was to sit on my hands and talk to you, it would have a different sound, and it wouldn't sound as natural. And I think you lose that when you script, because people are just reading words rather than emoting it. Actors and people of that genre would be able to do it, I'm sure. But people like you and me, who are not Oscar-winning actors, we're not going to be able to do it as well. So it is really important to make sure that you have your bullet points of what you want to talk about. So for me, for this episode, for example, I have got 5 pitfalls, 5 perks. I had my introduction, which was to mention the Mike Action podcast and to mention the new cohorts. And that's basically all I have done. And I am talking from that point of view. Okay, so over scripting. Number 5, not having good systems in place so everything takes twice as long. So this is another thing, is you don't know what you don't know. And that is what I have always said. You don't know what you don't know. When I started podcasting, I didn't go and do any kind of training for it. I just piecemealed it. I went to this site and learned how to do this. I went to that site and learned how to do this. I pulled together my own system for how I produce and create my podcast. And it took time, and it took a lot of time. Okay. And over the last 4 years, I have created a system that works for me. And I want to save people that time, because when I was starting my business, that was fine. I had the time because I was very new to business. So there wasn't much else I needed to be doing. So taking all the time that I was taking to do my podcast wasn't a big deal. But for people who are more established in their businesses and are just wanting to put this in as another marketing tool, they haven't got the time to sit there and work out what the best method of editing is. They haven't got time to sit there and work out how to get the best quality sound out of their environment. They haven't got time to sit and do all of these things. They just want to know the system and how to do it. That's what I teach in my Start Your Podcast program. That's why I teach it, because I don't want you to have to waste time trying to find all of the information out from all across the internet and then potentially giving up on your podcast because it's taking you too much time. So good systems in place will help save a lot of time. Okay, so moving on to the perks of podcasting, which is much more fun to talk about. So number one, and these are my personal perks. There may be podcasters out there that have different perks, but mine, no physical prep. I haven't got to do my hair. I haven't got to do my makeup. I haven't got to get dressed up. I haven't got to get camera ready. I don't even have to get dressed at all if I don't want to. I mean, technically, I could be sitting here in my birthday suit. I'm not. I never have. But technically I could if I wanted to. So any nudists out there that want a podcast, this is a great medium to use. But for me, it is that I can just switch on the mic exactly as I am and get it going. And that to me makes it an instant lower barrier to entry than videos, because in videos I want to make sure my hair's looking okay. I want to make sure that I can at least have a filter that I like on, because I really don't wear makeup anymore. It doesn't sit well on my skin. That's another story for another day. But I don't really wear makeup much, so I don't always think that I look my best. So those things would be a barrier, and it would be something that I would be like, no, I'm not going to do it. So that is the first perk, is those physical perks. Also, the second one is I can record at any time. So whether it's first thing in the morning, last thing at night, in the middle of the night, middle of the day, whenever, I can podcast. If you're doing a video, you've got to be more careful about that, because you need to know your lighting. So if you are in the day, you can use the natural lighting that's coming through your window. But if it's dark, and especially around wintertime, this cuts video opportunity down by loads. So I also have a YouTube channel which is more about my hobby, my crochet hobby, my crafting hobby. So probably not relevant to many people listening to this show, so I won't link it. But on there, I have gone through missing out on a lot of recording opportunities because I'm working during the day, and then when it was nighttime, it's pitch black, and I don't want to record a video in the dark. So you can't do that with videos, but you can with podcasts, because you don't need to worry about the lighting. So that is the other great thing about podcasting, is you can record it at any time. It doesn't get affected by whether it's light or dark outside. It doesn't matter with podcasting. So that's the second one. Number 3 is podcasts are simple to edit. And going back to the, people thinking it's easy and it's not, once you have learned how to edit a podcast, you can do it very, very quickly. However, with a video, you have to be wary of when you're cutting things out. So for example, if you are somebody who uses the word a lot, which is something that I suffer with, I do try to get away from it, and I do find that once I mention it, I then start trying to say it a lot more, so I have to be conscious of that. But if I was to do that in a video, I wouldn't be able to cut it out necessarily without it looking janky. Not so bad, but if it was a full sentence, for example, I messed up a sentence and I was trying to edit that out, it's going to look weird. There's going to be a jump cut there, and it might not look very seamless. And it depends on the type of editing that you want to do and the style that you want to do. There are plenty of YouTubers out there that use jump cuts a lot to change up the narrative so that people see something change in their eye and it keeps them engaged. But if it's because you're editing out mistakes in words, or you've said a sentence wrong and you've got to cut it out, sometimes it can be very hard to marry that up and make it look right to the viewer. Whereas if you're just cutting words out of an audio file, as long as it sounds okay, it doesn't matter what it would have looked like on video, because there's no video to worry about. So it makes editing a lot easier. And there are great ways of simplifying the editing process, which I teach in my Start Your Podcast program, to make sure that we are utilizing our time as efficiently as possible and getting the most out of that editing time. So that is number 3, simple editing. Number 4 is competition. So although I said, looking for thousands of downloads is a pitfall, what you do have to remember with podcasting is, compared to the other pillar content options of blogging or video creation, podcasting is still the baby. So there are 51 million YouTube channels last time I checked. There are 600 million blogs on the internet. And of course, the amount of these that are active versus inactive is up for debate. However, the number of podcasts that are out there is just around the 5 million mark. And that is all podcasts, so the inactive. So that is your comparison, if you like. You could say that of those blogs, only 100 million are active. Of those YouTube channels, only 10 million are active. Of the podcasts, only 300,000 are active. I need to check on my stats on that because I can't remember what they were at the last count, and it may have changed, but it was around a couple of 100,000 that were actually active. So it's still very new to the space, which means that if you can come in and have a good topic and a good podcast and get your listenership hooked, you can start to build momentum and you can start to be a bigger voice in the space. If we were to take YouTube, for example, back to when there was only 5 million YouTube channels out there, and talk to some of the creators that just started at that point and said, do you think you'll ever be as big as? And I think, I remember when my daughter was young, Zoella being a really big name in YouTube space for the youngsters. So do you think you'd ever be as big as Zoella? Mr. Beast, when did he start his YouTube, for example? I'm pretty sure that he was well into there being millions and millions and millions of YouTube channels on the platform at that stage. If you'd have turned around to somebody at that 5 million mark and said, do you think you'll ever be as big? They would probably say, oh no, I could never be as big as that. I'm not, it's not going to be possible for me to get there. Yet those same YouTubers are now some of the biggest YouTubers on the platform because they started and they stayed consistent. Okay, so that's a really important thing to remember, is it's not where you start, it's where you end that matters. And starting now with podcasting, if you can keep at it and keep consistent and keep the content good, then you really do stand a great chance of being one of the standout names in the podcasting space. Now, there are differences between podcasts that are run by companies versus indie podcasters. And that is something that there's always going to be an imbalance there, because the company podcasts have a lot of advertising budget behind them. They're the Dear Medias of the world that have, a lot of the reality stars have podcasts with them, people like that. But they're usually representing celebrity podcasts. They usually have a big ad budget and they're promoting it. So we never want to compare ourselves to those people, because that's not a like for like comparison. We want to compare ourselves to the people that are in a similar field to us. So for example, my guiding star, as it were, is somebody like Amy Porterfield, who started her podcast 10 years ago and now gets millions of downloads. But when she started, she was somebody who wasn't consistent with her podcast. She'd put out an episode here and there and she wasn't consistent with it at all. Now she has one of the biggest download business podcasts in the world. That is possible for you if you are consistent. And I want to bring that back to my pitfall of thousands of downloads and knowing your why, because still, if you don't want hundreds of thousands of clients, then you don't need hundreds of thousands of listeners. So it's not even that that's where you want to go, but if you can become a voice in your industry, in your space, in the world of podcasting, then you have much more opportunity to be a leading voice in that space on the podcast platforms. So that is number 4. And number 5 is the interview opportunities. So yes, you could say that with YouTube you could have this as well, but I feel like people are more, there's a bit of a prestige around being interviewed on a podcast versus, oh, I'm going on a YouTube channel. So interviews for podcasts are great. I love interviewing people, as you well know. And one of my favorite, heart-stopping moments was when I got to have Amy Porterfield on my podcast, because like I said, she is my guiding star of, what a podcast could be. And that to me was amazing. And I would never have had that opportunity had I not had my podcast or had a platform. So this would go for any platform, okay? Whether you decide to do a YouTube channel or a podcast. And it does have to be that thing where you can interview somebody. So not necessarily a blog. It wouldn't work so well in that instance for the reason that I interviewed Amy. So I interviewed her on her book launch. And that was something that she put out to her audience. She said, look, I'm looking to go onto podcasts. If you've got a podcast, or if you've got a video show, or you've got a Facebook group or things like that, we could do that. So you have to have those platforms in order to attract the people you want to interview. So I was very lucky in that. I'm not here to turn around and say I've got some magic source that got Amy on my podcast. It is my favorite episode because of the fact that it's her that I got to interview. Would I love to have her back in again on my podcast? From my own personal benefit, absolutely, I would, to be able to interview her with my own questions about her business rather than because she's launching her book. I would absolutely love to do that. But it was great to be able to do that. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity to actually speak with her personally had I not done a podcast, if I hadn't got a podcast out there. So it was amazing for that. So those are your perks and pitfalls of podcasting. And it's not an exhausted list by any stretch of the imagination. It's just my feelings, my thoughts, my meanderings around it. So that is basically it for this week on the podcast. However, I did think, you know what? I do this quick fire round with all my guests so we can get to know them a little bit better. Yeah, I've never actually answered the questions for myself. I've kind of said to other people, oh yes, I would like to do that, or I would do this instead, or whatever when we're talking, but I haven't actually answered the questions myself. So I thought I would put myself through my own quick fire round. And I'm going to be quick. I'm not going to elaborate too much. I'm going to try and keep this short. So what is my favorite podcast to listen to and why? So this changes depending on, what season of life I'm in. So like I said, Amy Porterfield's was my go-to from 2014. I listened to her nonstop for about 3 years, I think, before I started missing episodes. And now I don't listen to her as much, I have to say. Currently, my favorite podcast listen is Not for Lazy Marketers. It's the podcast by Emily Hirsch. And if you are on my email list, donnaeade.com/podsquad, if you want to get on it, you will know that because I mention her a lot in my newsletters and tell people that I've listened to her episodes. So she is one of my favorites. If it is health and wellness, I want to give a shout out to Catherine and Julie, the Far Too Fabulous podcast. I absolutely love listening to those girls talk because I know them personally. I know they know what they're talking about and I trust them completely with the information that they're giving out. So I absolutely love listening to those ladies as well. There are a number of other podcasts that I really enjoyed listening to. Being Soul Confident by Nicola Tonsaga is one that I am listening to now that she has released it, and I'm really enjoying that because her voice is just so beautiful. So there are a number of podcasts that I really enjoy, and there are probably about, I think probably about 10 that I have in rotation on my phone, and I just listen to them when I go out for my walk. So that really wasn't quick, was it? I'll try and be quicker. What book has made the most impact on your life thus far, Donna? Well, that would be Ramit Sethi, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. If you haven't read it, go and read the book. It is not a get rich quick scheme book. It is a practical advice book on how to manage your finances. And I listened to this book probably again back in about 2014, and it helped me get out of the debt that I was in as a single parent on my own with my daughter. I was able to implement his strategy for looking after your money, and I not only got out of debt, but for the first time ever, I had thousands of pounds in my savings account, which had never happened in my life before. So I really don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I really kind of praise that book and Ramit's work for putting me on the right path when it comes to looking after my money. And I've not been back in debt since. So if you want to sort of get to grips with your money, that book, Ramit Sethi, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. I'll link it in the show notes for you. Your go-to snack when you're in a hurry. I don't tend to snack, in all honesty. If I'm in a hurry, I probably won't eat. If I'm on the go, I don't eat. So, for example, on the first Friday of the month where I go up and do my coaching, I leave at like 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't eat breakfast before I go. I travel up there. I don't have food in the car. I don't like eating in the car. So I don't have anything until I get up to my coach's house, into her training room, and then it's probably around between 11 and 1 before I actually eat something. So that is just what it is. I just don't eat on the go. So I am not a big snacker in that way. I am a big chocolate fan. I like a couple of squares of dark chocolate in the evening with a cup of tea after I finish my dinner as a way to kind of round off the day. If I am not in a hurry, then I love some popcorn with a film, some sweet popcorn, not salty. I do not like salty popcorn, but that is kind of where my snack thing is. Your ultimate self-care thing to do. My ultimate self-care thing to do is to do nothing. That is my ultimate, because I don't do it very often. The only time I'm really doing nothing is when I am sleeping. And that isn't great. I do a lot of scrolling, which is still doing something. But if I can just chill my mind, do a meditation and just be, that is my greatest form of self-care. Okay, guys, so that is it. That wraps up this week's episode of the Mindset and Action podcast. Don't forget to go over and listen to Mike Action podcast where you get your podcasts. And I will see you in the next one. Bye for now. If you're looking to build a deeper connection with your audience this year and you're a passionate business owner with a message to share, then I would love to help you do that via podcasting. If you're interested in starting a podcast this year, head over to donnaeade.com/apply to register your interest today. Don't forget to hit subscribe where you listen and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. You can also share this episode with a friend. It is a great way to help the podcast out to get to more listeners just like you.